very busy week here. We have on Wednesday at 2 o'clock, there's a Wednesday episode here. I forget the title of it. Wednesday?
Small things. I think Paul was
Small things. Small things.
Yeah.
Okay, 2 o'clock, Wednesday episode. Then that evening, we have the opening of the faculty exhibition, Primitive Delights. Then on Friday, we have another episode at 2 o'clock around the show, Primitive Delights, with the various contributors to the show and a discussion. A week from today, right before Thanksgiving week, will be a book launch and chat of Radical Postmodernism with our clinical professor, Sam Jacob, who is the co-editor of that volume by AT on Monday at 5. So you get out of the studio earlier on Monday. Tonight, it's a great pleasure to welcome Roger Sherman to UIC. Roger founded Roger Sherman Architecture and Urban Design in 1988 when he won the commission for the West Hollywood Civic Center as a result of an international competition. RSAUD, that's its acronyms, award-winning work. Work that scales from single-family residential to mixed-use development to urban design and landscape, includes Fresh Kills landfill and use plant, the Gateway Recycling Center and Park in Toledo, and has appeared in the New York Times and History Channel, and featured at the Museum of Modern Art, Victoria Albert Museum, and most recently the International Architecture Biennale in Rotterdam. His 3-in-1 house in Santa Monica won House of the Year Award by Architecture Magazine, and his design research project, Duck and Cover for Rethinking Big Box Retail, just won an LA AIA Honor Award. Roger's also been named a Star of Design by LA Pacific Design Center. You get a star, you get something worse. Worse. Roger is an associate professor at UCLA and was recently a visiting faculty member at Harvard's Graduate School of Design and also visiting faculty at the University of Michigan. Before UCLA, Roger was a long-standing faculty member at SciArc. He is currently co-director, along with Dana Cuff, of City Lab and Urban Design and Planning think tank at UCLA, and also a board member of the AIA LA, where he co-chairs the Political Outreach Committee, and has also served on the boards of Livable Places, the West Side Urban Forum, and the City of West Hollywood's Cultural Heritage Advisory Board. Roger is the author of three primary books, Re-American Dream, 6 new housing prototypes for Los Angeles, and within just the last year, to hawk his products. Just the last year, 2 books, very productive. LA Under the Influence, which I highly recommend, and that's a good introduction. And Fast Forward Urbanism, also co-edited with Dana Cuff. The LA Under the Influence is really a long-standing project of Roger that's gone through many research iterations in his own work in his schools at SciArc and UCLA. And equally the influence with data in the City Lab, of Fast Forward Urbanism. I think Roger has many fans in the school because his work has great echoes with a lot of the things happening here. I would say maybe its significance, or let's say one big aspect of it, we've talked a lot about the project of complexity in architecture and urbanism. I think Roger's education at Harvard in the 80s was one place where complexity was thought as a formal problem, let's say, a kind of collage contextual problem. More recently, we've seen complexity thinking in architecture and urbanism with Sanford Quinter, and with the idea of a form as an event. We spent a long time talking about this in lecture class in many cases. I think Roger's contribution really is to think of form as an agreement. In other words, if Sanford Quinter's contribution to thinking about form is through scientific and biological analogies, Rogers really sets up form as an agreement meaning between specific parties in specific legal and economic context, market context. In his own work about both analyzing that as a fact, but also then seeing ways to liberate urban strategies from those sorts of what he calls piggybacking and other urban operations that he extends into the work from that analysis. I will say I also had the great pleasure for a long time of teaching alongside Roger at UCLA. It's one of the things that I miss greatly about UCLA is having Roger as a sounding board. I would say he should have won the LA part of the City of the Future competition. Along with others. Yeah, there's some other people on the team. Roger put together a team, and I have to say, it was, again, it's a little John McMorrow. There are many anecdotes about Roger I can't tell the public. This one will be slightly on the verge of yes and no to tell the public. But Roger's 3-in-1 house for that competition kind of became a 20-in-1 project for at least the week of the duration of the competition with everybody in his house at all hours. I mean, and I just recall this one moment when we got somebody had donated this huge acrylic sheet, which we figured out a strategy for how to make a model of, but the paper wouldn't come off because it was so old. And we had across the dining room table this huge piece of like 1-inch thick acrylic, brown paper that wouldn't come off. We're pouring turpentine all over this thing in the middle of his dining room, pouring off the edges in his new 3-in-1 house. And Roger's very understanding partner and wife, Jennifer, came walking in, looked twice, shook her head, and kept walking on. But I have to say, Jennifer's an architect, so she also understands this. But I will say that Roger, probably as part of his theory, likes to make his life more complicated than it has to be, as a way of really showing the virtuosity of the way in which he negotiates his way out of it. So, please join me in welcoming Roger.
Can you all hear me? Yes. I can hear myself. Maybe that's all that matters. Thank you, Bob. Oh, too much feedback? Better turn it down. It's good to be back at UIC. I was here 5 years ago as part of the search that you had that led to Bob's being selected. I'd like to think that I had a large part to do in helping Bob look like he was the best candidate, at which I clearly succeeded. So if you have any complaints about Bob, you have me to blame. Anyway, yes, that stops with me. Anyway, it is genuinely great to be back, and amongst many friends and colleagues as well. I think seeing as I do have a level of comfort with everybody, and it's in many cases have been conducting, as I have with Bob, an ongoing conversation about many of the things I'm going to talk about tonight. I decided that I was going to kind of err on the side of kind of showing more kind of some things that are maybe more could be termed better as experiments, things that are kind of crossing the line between pure practice and some of the teaching that I'm doing at the moment. Experiments that are not closed, but rather kind of open up some interests and pursuits that are not yet resolved, but at the same time kind of give you a sense of some roads that I'm kind of traveling on, maybe in light of the fact that the books came out, and when books come out, you kind of feel as though they finally bring closure to a certain portion of your work, and it's time to kind of see where some of those trajectories head. So I am going to talk a little bit in the context of some of the History Channel project that I'll mention parenthetically that I worked on with Bob and with Dana. There'll be a little bit from the book, but only as a means of referencing some things that we've been doing, that I've been working on over the last few years, some things that are as recent as just a short time ago, just a month ago or so. I wanted to, I think in trying to kind of collect them, there were about 2.5 or 3 projects that I'm going to show in different degrees of detail. I realized that the thing that all 3 of them sort of circulate around, which might serve as a thesis for tonight, really has to do with talking about the question of the extent to which the nature of audience has changed today in the world, and what effect that really has had or should be having upon the way that we practice and the way that we, more particularly, that we think about authorship, what we do. There's a lot of discussion about globalization. I'm not one of the people who heralds, the be-all and end-all, but I think that there are more complex and in many ways subtle implications that have come from that. And one of them, which I'm showing in the first slide, is the fact that the real import is not the lack of geographic boundaries. The real import is really having to do with the complexity of our affiliations today and the ways in which it's very difficult to ascertain exactly how and who we identify with. And not beyond, probably to a much lesser extent than we may consider ourselves Americans, for instance, or you might Chicagoans and myself and Angelino. We have certain products that we like to buy, we have certain religions that we might espouse, and for each of us, what determines a kind of individuality is a very particular combination of memberships in different groups. That is to say that we don't belong to one member, we are not a member of any one group, that any one of us actually belongs to a number of different groups. These are some of in visual culture, the things that I'm showing you here are just a couple of examples, 4 examples of different very strange variations on this. I showed you obviously, if you didn't know, I'm sorry, Murakami working for Louis Vuitton. So you may not like Louis Vuitton, but you might like Murakami, and you might buy a bag for one reason, or you might be obviously selling Coca-Cola, Muslims who drink Coke, crossing the bridge of size between a large insurance company, multinational conglomerate, and so on. So this kind of very funny, I hope you can kind of see it, Venn diagram, which I oftentimes refer to, kind of in a humorous way, kind of points out the very complex web of this would be kind of seen as a kind of genetic or social fingerprint of an individual and the very particular ways in which their likes and dislikes end up getting mapped with one another. We tend to look at them as larger groups from a macro perspective, where you look at one big group for every circle. But in fact, this is in fact representing the very particular map of a given kind of human being. So I wanted to somehow figure out how as authors, architects figure out who we're actually designing for, and the extent to which, if we move beyond the architect as his own or her own brand, we can begin to uncover some more interesting ways of redirecting our techniques in ways that are productive, and most importantly, really restore a certain degree of relevancy for our discipline. I say relevancy because I'm really not as interested in meaning, as the question of meaning, as I am just what matters to people. So this is however quickly it was produced and crudely, it was a diagram that for me is still a touchstone that we produced with Bob several years ago, which really talks about the phenomenon viewed from a kind of larger perspective, which is the extent to which over the last 100 years, the number of groups, of identity groups, has exponentially multiplied from very few groups, where, as I mentioned, people are kind of see themselves as belonging to a religion or a member of a citizen of a given country, to very particular combinations or groups, whether in ignominy or in status. But there is clearly a desire that is expressed through the metastasization of the number of these groups, for people to find a means of distinguishing who they are by virtue of finding ever more specific niche groups. We see this, of course, with coffee, where it's not enough any longer to just have 3 brands of coffee, but you're very. But this can be it can be an incredibly daunting problem when one is looking at working as an architect in a kind of market-driven culture, and trying to address an impossibly large number of people who all have differing ideas of what they care about. In thinking things out in the last few days, I realized that this diagram from Chile came to mind, because I think that there was a time during the 1990s when La Villette was conceived that deconstruction minus the social project really would be a way of somehow dealing with the idea or expressing this social fragmentation. through some kind of rhetoric. But it in fact occurred as an entirely kind of formal set of ideas, and also was dedicated to the idea, or committed to the idea, that complexity was generated through the composite. That's to say that more was better. You simply added different things up, and through heterogeneity, you achieved complexity. The same, I would say, even more recently, in this representation of Holland as a country by, I'm sure all of you know, a project a few years ago by MBRDB. The idea is that if you pile up all the assets, you get the idea of the whole somehow. That is, x, a plus b plus c plus d plus e equals somehow everybody together, a kind of idea of a fragmented unity. I think what my lecture is going to present, this is called the Pugloaf. And this is the model that I'm interested in exploring, and I think I'm going to try to argue in the first project that I think is a more provocative way to think about it, which is a kind of looking to the art of advertising, and specifically the techniques that advertisers use, as in the use of montage, to create complex composites that are not so easily divisible, and whose ambiguity is something that is able to achieve a sense of collectivity without sacrificing singularity, and without they're also exercising exclusivity. There are obviously a number of artists I'm interested in, such as Damien Hirst, where you get a very similar effect. If you look at the piece at one scale, it conveys one idea. You walk up closer and you get what I call you get a bit of a kind of a shock, because something is actually underlined by something else. But the meanings are secreted in one another. They're not, the complexity is not intended to be trumpeted. It's intended to be something that actually is divulged in a more difficult and kind of clever way. I refer to it with my students, and we use a number of these examples as kind of touchstones for our studios, as a kind of double take. The idea of the double take, rather than the thing where it's the, hey, look at me first. Same thing, this is another one many of you may know, which is the diamond encrusted skull. Doho-Soo, this is actually a model, a full-scale replication of his house in New York, in silk, which kind of creates a very different kind of form of familiarization, but defamiliarization at the same time, and the rematerialization of the conventional thing brings in other sensibilities and other identities with it. As a result of this kind of general cultural phenomenon, I won't call it a malaise, because I don't think it's something to actually be for anything to be eulogized or worried about. I think that what this second diagram, which we also produced as part of the study that we worked on, is that concomitant with the multiplication of those identities has come the increase in a number of what Van called enclaves, holes, places within the urban fabric, which are carved out for the purposes of differing identity groups to live together with people who are just like themselves. The tendency that is one that has worried many, and I find also worrisome, is not necessarily the fact that these enclaves are increasing, because that's actually that's symptomatic of a set of developments that we can really not do that much about. What's more problematic, and this is just another way of conveying it that we worked on, which is that in 1906, Los Angeles had one or two enclaves inside of it. That's the black figure that's on the far right. And as Los Angeles grew in size, that's the area that's in black, the number of holes or enclaves, which we call the ozones, also metastasizes, increases in numbers. So there are more and more holes in the Swiss cheese. Even though the sum is getting larger, the actual amount of we should call it holiness. You know, the amount of holes, the density of holes is increasing, or enclaves. That, however, as I was mentioning, is not really so much the problem as is the issue of its exclusivity. The fact that those holes have, up until now, in one form or another, whether it's a historic overlay zone, as in the upper right, or in the lower left, a gated community, seem to necessitate or seem to require that they be closed to the general public in order to ensure their efficacy, their financial and social success. I, on the other hand, therefore wanted to look at the idea of how one could use the kinds of techniques that I was referring to earlier with Damien Hirst and the other images that I showed, techniques that are used by advertisers to actually find means of attracting people to live in certain enclaves while at the same time not necessarily requiring that they be closed. That is to amp up the degree of attraction to the extent that that it in some ways could be compensatory for a more defensive strategy of basically, instead of saying I'm going to rely upon the degree of closure of the boundaries, I'm going to look at interesting ways whereby the enclosure, the enclave itself can serve as a decoy. So more in a more figurative than literal way to Venturi's doctrine, to serve as a means of attracting people to live near it. We have some examples, some of which you know, such as Wrigley Field, which may not have looked like, this is why it's like Damien Hirst for me, it may not look like an enclave, but it actually creates a sense of identity that extends beyond the figure of the ballpark itself. I'm sure you may have seen this from time to time, perhaps presented or talked about in this thing. And in that sense, there's a kind of a social ecology. But the design of the decoy is the design project. In other words, it's the attributes that one actually accords to the decoy that necessitates technique and necessitates that kind of formal intelligence. This is actually a funnier example, which is really remarkably good, which is somebody who put designed a floor, an advertiser that designed a floor with the imprint of the dog on it, so that as you're in the upper floors of the atrium, the people walking across the lobby are the fleas on the dog. So this is a kind of funny thing where it's obviously not operating as an enclave, but it's showing how the advertiser kind of gets it. The advertiser is trying to co-opt kind of everyday life, not in a way that's entirely unlike Wrigley Field, in order to capture a sense of belonging, even if accidentally, and trick other people into feeling as though they're going to be part of it. There is some history of this. There's Place Vendôme in Paris, which was effectively built like a Hollywood backset in order to give the appearance of uniformity, and then the lots were sold off around it. You probably near at home know about Central Park, which was really a real estate junket, in which the park was approved as a public amenity, but was really done so as a kind of a gambit, a kind of Trojan horse, if you will, a real estate gambit, whereby all the people who owned the properties around the park that were not yet developed knew that eventually their income, they would reap the benefits of the attributes to the park. So they did pitch in some money, but the idea again was that it looked like it was one thing, but it turned out to be another. And of course, this to this day, I think, operates as one of the kind of best forms of enclave. It's clearly as an open enclave. It operates clearly as an enclave that people identify with, even if they're not directly on the park. New Yorkers also consider it to be something that they identify with, just as part of the island. But again, in a way, it required that people needed to be tricked into it to an extent, rather than the means of operating more defensively through the traditional enclave. More outrageous examples are London Bridge, Arizona, where they simply purchased the London Bridge in London and moved it. And this was the kind of eureka development idea where you're trying. This is I kind of say it's early Bilbao, you just borrow fame, something that's notorious, and you move it and you say, we're now, everybody knows the London Bridge, but they don't know where we are. So if we move the London Bridge, they will know where we are. And then development occurs by a kind of form of immaculate conception. I would argue this is not, I'm not putting this in so much as an example of a successful design project as much as a kind of form of, there's a kind of P.T. Barnummism and an audacity that it kind of requires to an extent, but what this doesn't do is in many ways guarantee that there's sufficient control over the development that then does occur, that the enclave becomes more than the initial gambit. So I would be critical of this example. In the realm of the big box, which is what I'm going to, the first project that I'm going to show you, and one of the things that actually interested me about it, there has been a kind of interesting and brief history of trying to use similar kinds of techniques, gimmicky techniques, to draw the public into a store that otherwise doesn't really have any kind of marketing edge over other stores. I was interested both in its crossover into the question of the enclave, but really more, I'm sorry, not into the question of the enclave, but the idea of how you actually create a decoy. But moreover, because in the more current scene, these big boxes, as many of you know, at least the ones that operate according to a suburban model, have now become something of outliers, literally and figuratively, in that the business model of the big box has changed as the U.S. population, at any rate, has shifted dramatically into cities, and so profit margins are falling off for the big boxes rather dramatically, and big box retailers are being forced to consider developing urban sites where the populations now are, but oftentimes with a great deal of community resistance to their being there because of the detrimental effects they have on the kind of communities, the more tight-knit communities that surround them. So I was interested in the site projects that I just showed you as some way of trying to look at whether or not there was a way of thinking about the popularity of the big box when it actually is working, the very fact that people like to go to places like Costco, and to look at whether or not, rather than simply pasting up and trying to be apologetic for the fact that it was there and making things seem less bad, whether or not a more robust model of looking at the big box as actually a kind of latent form of community life, which is in fact what it is in many respects. I have relatives who will spend hours there and are never happier than when they're actually doing that, couldn't therefore be extended into a kind of urbanism that turned a fixed sum game into a variable sum game. And it seemed to me that in doing this kind of very brief history of commercial development from the window display of centuries before to Venturi's decorated sheds, and Duck to a new model which acknowledged the existence of Google Earth and other technologies of dissemination, that there could be an interesting way of trying to turn the model on its head and say that the answer was not to get rid of big boxes or to try to green them up, but rather to try to turn them into something more than they are and make them into the best thing that a community could ever hope for, because it was actually going to save communities that were, many communities that were in need of revitalization or tax revenue. In doing the research for the project, I was really interested in the work of this photographer, whose name now escapes me, whose work consists of taking the names, the graphics off of signs that exist in the city, and to actually begin to understand that there's a kind of interesting middle ground between the architecture of signage that exists in cities and the actual advertising, the words themselves, and whether or not there's actually something that signage can contribute in a way that can be separated, if you will, from examples such as Times Square and others, where you're kind of taking a centrifuge to the idea of graphic design, and you're trying to take the kind of idea that the architecture of the sign actually could have some interesting value and even be somewhat recognizable simply in its shape, apart from whether or not words actually appear on it. There are other people, such as Gursky, who are using a more kind of aerial perspective to begin to similarly explore the identity of landscapes and communities through these other more latent, this is actually digitally manipulated. But the point is, just as the other one was, but the point is that there's a kind of interesting middle ground, whether it's through the signage or through the material palette or pattern of the landscape that actually carries an embedded identity along with it. So I was interested in trying to find out whether or not, if in a certain way, by tying one hand behind one's back, one could actually get more juice out of some of the patterns that we actually take for granted, and could see how they could yield things. Of course, this is more well known as another model of the power of the area. But our thought was not in the example that I had given, this last one, which is the model for the project I'm going to show you duck and cover. It's not so much the fact that it uses an aerial alone, it's that the oblique surface, the slope surface, has the ability to operate both at the street level view and actually have a different identity from the air. So they may be differing identities, but it communicates from a variety of different perspectives. So this is the kind of a diagram that we generated, which kind of restates something that what I had mentioned earlier, which is that as opposed to the wolf in sheep's clothing, which is, let's say, the new urbanist model or the kind of conventional model of big boxes that have to deal with angry communities, where you try to make it look like what in my day was a Ponderosa steakhouse that looked like a streetscape that just happened to be set back 200 feet from the curb, but was clearly not. The idea was to be somewhat unapologetic, and rather to say that this was a tremendous opportunity both to engage the space of the big parking lot as a development opportunity that expands the identity of the big box retailer rather than trying to recede from it and being overly discreet. And then moreover, you could do it in a way that communities would embrace if that identity was embedded with program and other ways and urban, kind of a set of urban programs that actually became something that the community could identify with and find useful. In thinking about this, I realized that later that it grew upon in one of the case studies that appears in the LA Under the Influence book, which is called, in Los Angeles, it's kind of called colloquially the Flower Tower. This was something that I had driven by for about 10 some years and never really knew what it was. As did a lot of other Angelinos. So it was kind of like the pug loaf, where it looked a little bit like we weren't sure quite what it was. It looked vaguely in shape, like a smokestack. This is actually, it existed for the first 10 years without any flower pattern on it. It had a flower pattern. It basically begged the question, what am I? It was like a puzzle or a rebus that you needed to solve, which itself was worthy of whose intrigue was worthy of something in my mind. And then in doing the research for the Flower Tower, there was a very interesting story that unfolded about the fact that it actually turned out to have been an oil derrick that sits on the property of Beverly Hills High School, right at the border where Beverly Hills lets onto Century City. So there's a little patch of land owned that's leased by the oil company from Beverly Hills High School, and there's a huge web of underground oil lines which extend under about 2 miles in every, a 2 mile radius under the homes of a lot of Beverly Hills residents and the school itself, and draws a tremendous amount of money and pays out royalties to all of those. In fact, it constitutes about 18% of the budget of Beverly Hills High School's operating budget is actually subsidized by the royalties, the mineral rights paid by the oil company. But the more interesting part of the story was that at the time that it was put up, there was no Century City. That's the first image, the first stage. The second stage shows how, as a result of the construction of Century City, in the gray that you see right there, the residents of Century City began complaining that it was making too much noise in pumping. And so as a result of that, they clad the tower with acoustical cladding to prevent the noise. Once that was actually clad, a nonprofit group representing children with cancer throughout California, different cancer wards, saw it as an opportunity because of its axial position on the road, as an opportunity, as a kind of accidental landmark, as a means of actually, it was an advertising opportunity in the making. And that's when the pads were then appropriated and sent out. They got permission and they sent the acoustical pads out to each of these cancer wards, had a pattern on them, and the kids all painted the flowers according to an artist's design. And so the result is that this very complex web of interests of different stakeholders actually is combined in one very kind of singular image, in one very singular moment, in a way that no monument to Iwo Jima, with a series of soldiers planting the flags, would have meaning anymore. In other words, traditional monumentality that memorializes things through conventions of symbolism that are singular in one way don't hold the degree of relevancy or really fail by comparison to the kind of complexity of the puzzle by which this newfangled kind of monument is composed, whose meaning is not entirely evident. In a similar way, when we started working on the project, which was done for Target, not for their architecture department, but for their marketing department and advertising department, we started by looking at, on their very own website, something called Target Communities, which talks about everything Target does for your community. It was intended to be the grease, the wheel, the thing that makes everybody think that Target's the good guy coming into your community, and all those things that you will do, but they're going to do it through money that they give you, through nonprofits, basically through software, not hardware, as a means of kind of Protestant ethic, making up for their sins through actually doing nice things for the community. But in doing that, we actually went further into the website and we discovered that there were they dissected the community according to their merchandise. There was a kind of correlation. So we created the names, but there were ways that they would reposition themselves depending upon the community to address the kind of interests and merchandise that each community might have. And it was interesting because the virtues of Target were oftentimes aimed at communities who were lacking in something that they actually had, rather than saying that we're like you. So for instance, if you're in an urban area, they would say we've got great camping gear and recreation stuff and all these other kinds of things. So we developed a kind of campaign of sorts called Target Nation, which took 3 hypothetical sites, one of which was right on the edge of suburbia, which has no urban center, one in a suburban area of Phoenix, in what is called a power center, which has a number of big boxes all slammed together with one another, with an absolutely enormous parking lot. And then another one in a relatively dense area of Brooklyn near the Gowanus Canal. And we placed them in accordingly, where Target Town offered something that this suburb with no center did not have. And in fact, of course, many of these commercial developments that come to suburbs call themselves centers, very much in recognition of that. Target Green came to a parched part of Phoenix, which is a real shortage of anything that's actually planted. And Target Play provided private open space for an area that had a very low capita amount of recreational space for its population. Oh, one last thing before we go on. For each of these, we developed a differing technique by which we were going to work on that diagonal surface. For Target Town, we took as the early diagram that I showed you, the history of commercial display indicated, the target is carved and twisted like a corkscrew. In the next one, it is it's a tab, which is actually kind of flipped up. And then the last one is more topological, which is consistent with it being a kind of play surface. Oops. Okay, so this is a kind of section cut through target play, through one of them. You'll see what the aerial actually looks like, or you may have seen a kind of small version of it, but in point of fact, when you look across it, that flat pattern of the various targets actually is very rich sectionally, and in fact has places of slippage where the surface slides down and creates a kind of series of smaller, I call it clownfish retail, kind of accessory retail that likes being next to big boxes. Many of you know that that's a kind of commercial ecology, as well as having additional parking that's tucked underneath. There's also parking on the roofs, assumed to be on the roofs of all of these big boxes. So you can walk both down into Target or right across and get onto the space, onto the recreational surface, or you can walk right off of the sidewalk and up to it as well. Also, we had a kind of programming pattern that was assigned to each of the rings of the target. These colors don't mean anything except to say that they're affiliated with the specific functions or programs that are attached to those differing types of activities that are attached to their merchandise. So one can kind of look at it like a test track for a car dealership, a place where you can try out the stuff. This references back a kind of project that we had done several years ago in Toledo, Ohio, where they had asked us for an art piece to try to revitalize a neighborhood, this emerging warehouse district of Toledo, and we said, you're not going to do it with a sculpture. You're going to need to find and you're not going to just do it with a landscape. You're going to need to find a way of harnessing differing stakeholders and attaching them to the kind of cladding of the surface, so that this surface, rather than being merely decorative, is a kind of inventory of what Toledo supplies and who's there. So it actually operates as a series of, as a recycling center with drop-off lanes, pickup lanes for differing recycled materials. And we have a kind of complex matrix whereby differing materials, these are the materials that are actually exchanged, either turned in or picked up, like mulch in the spring, or salt for the road for your driveway. And all of these materials are the display materials that you would find in a hardware store, but all of those materials that are on display are manufactured by companies that are in Toledo, companies that were donating to the construction of the project itself. So they were vested in the project as well. So we had a kind of network set up between the recycling center of the city of Toledo, the manufacturers like Pilkington Glass, and Corber's Beer, a number of others as well that could identify with what it was. Here's a kind of short inventory, and then under different climatic conditions, these different swatches would get activated depending upon whether cars were going out by it at night, hitting the reflectors with their headlights, or whether it was snowing, or whether or not it happened to be raining onto the windshields and so on. These are some of the stakeholders, even the mud hens, who are the namesake of the semi-pro team that has its home there. So you would pull up in these lanes. There was a screen that would open up on the back side of the slopes, and then there was each of the lanes of the main parkway, there were pull-off lanes, not unlike a kind of toll booth, except instead of being in the center, they were off to the side, like exit lanes. So to get back to Target, this is Target Play. It operated according to in a very different way. You really have no indication as to how the section operates, and there is no correlation, moreover, between the actual position of the targets from the air and the actual topological development of the target. So they're offset like a kind of piece of op art, deliberately to kind of confuse. You can see how the disjunction begins to kind of get played out and to kind of dazzle with it. That was also a form of using the target thing as a kind of, we were trying to kind of camouflage the kind of very bald-faced interest in advertising to make it actually seem more toned down, like it was something else other than it was. And this is from the ground. We had other sets of images like this pinball thing that were the kinds of things that it might induce as a kind of association, accidentally or otherwise, that kind of would come together as that might occur to people that might suggest the idea of play. And yet we did not have slides in the way that you would think about buying a slide or buying a hot tub. Everything was a kind of a surface that had possibility embedded within it rather than necessarily being based upon performativity. For Target Town, it was similarly, there was more correlation between the targets and the way that the twist was actually developed upward. Here they were corkscrewed up, and thereby also disguised the targets because you couldn't see them on the surface anyway because they were pulled apart from one another. There was actually some housing in here, a post office, there was a car wash, a bus stop, a variety of all the things that you would ordinarily sort of find in a town that were all in effect in one place. This is a section of that, quite a lot going on, and these are two details blown up out of different pieces of this. Also, there was a kind of development of a lenticular surface around on the vertical surfaces, so the targets are really only evident on the horizontal surfaces, where the vertical ones begin to carry images which are broken across and begin to identify what the, at least notationally, what the different uses are, rather than necessarily graphically, rather than necessarily alluding to target. And then Target Green was not so much a project about sustainability as the diagram indicated. It was actually intended to be about all things green. So it was as much about tennis courts or a petting zoo or golf putting greens as it was about anything having to do with agriculture or that kind of traditional idea, because the idea was merely that the use of the term green was merely a kind of conceit to bring together people of varying interests who may be interested in ecology or may just have no interest in it whatsoever, but they are coming together in order to, under the umbrella of a kind of imagistic singularity. So there is actually a casino that is tucked underneath this kind of hump, and the pieces where the ground is actually excavated and popped out in the main surface actually then reappear up above in the form of this series of disc-like solar panels. There's an aviary that's actually up here between them. So that in other words, there's a kind of translation of pieces that are out here to being up here, and then there are kind of service stairs for crew that take them up for maintenance of these pieces. So here you can see some of the putting greens. You can look through the back of the putting green to where the casino looks out through these kind of quasi-dormer windows. There's actually an orchard that's up at the front. There are zones of different use. There's a campground as well in other places as well. There are even some kind of fish tanks that occur in places as well. So having done the experiment with Target, we hypothesized that could be extended to the use of other types of big boxes in the manner that we're showing here in a variety of different ways. So these are the two examples. These are the three techniques we used for Target, and we just tried it on on a couple of other examples. And imagined being kind of grandiose about it, this kind of coincided at the time that this movie came out, and actually imagined to most people's horrors what the city might look like if it were actually made up out of nothing but big boxes advertising all of the time. Okay. So the second project, I'm going to talk about for much less time, is located right here. It's in South Central Los Angeles. It's an incredibly impoverished area that's had a lot of problems with drive-by shootings, a lot of gang activity. There was the site of the Watts riots. This is a medical center. Martin Luther King Junior Medical Center, which has been closed due to a lot of unfortunate incidents cases that have been mishandled at the hospital, and the community is suffering very badly. So what we did was we looked at this is a shopping center right now, a 15-acre site that's failing at the moment, and we looked. We've been working with the County of Los Angeles to look at something that might be developed on this site that could serve as a new center for the community that also happens to be hooked into the crossing of the Green Line and Blue Line station called Rosa Park Station. This is called Playa Rosa, accordingly, where a lot of people could potentially commute, but there are a lot of systemic problems that exist at that place whose stories kind of need to be kind of peeled away. And we, in doing our research, found that in fact there's a lack of any transportation. Most of the families own less than one car, and so there's very little mobility from this community, which is really a problem with public health, with childhood obesity, with a variety of other things that are causing the community to be very unstable. So we looked at the idea of trying to actually create a kind of urban beach that would be that kind of displacement of a model of social equity that the beach represents in Los Angeles as the kind of par excellence public space, social space. And we worked through a series of different infrastructural systems to create a kind of watershed that actually connected or was at the center of a larger urban watershed within the metropolitan area that collected more than just this 15 acres, but actually went 30 blocks, collected water 30 blocks in a 30-block radius around the project. But moreover, it kind of expressed itself rhetorically as both a kind of building in, I think, through the use of water, not as merely a kind of ecological element, but as something that actually became a kind of a social center for people there, and it was also connected to an operation as a kind of a social hub and also a kind of energy production that again did not look so much, as you'll see, does not look so much like what it does as having some other strange image that you then begin to understand later. So I'm kind of giving you a little bit of the back room explanation, which is basically that it's collecting water from all the surrounding streets that comes into the center and then is actually tied into the irrigation of some of the open space that's down at the bottom. And there are these, you're going to see this hopefully if this film, I'm going to show you a short film in a second, that tracks the different transportation systems that are also wound into the site itself. And then it also operates as a kind of mothership of an energy grid of these kind of solar aerosols, things that actually, they look like beach umbrellas, but they actually happen to have solar on them. I prefer to think about them just as a kind of viral image-giving device that begins to establish this site as the new center of the community, but provides a kind of increment, a radical increment that is able to basically be able to spread and begin to, through the referencing of the location of all of these, of all those umbrellas through the neighborhood in a kind of Christo-like way, make reference to the kind of main site itself. Okay, so let me see, how do I need to, how do I fix it? I just need to minimize the screen so I can turn that on. There you go, okay. Let's see. Oh, okay, well. I'm just gonna, I guess this is not cooperating, so I'm gonna go on. I'll show you these. How do I? Okay, great. All right. I'll just show you the renderings then, which is basically along the main boulevard. There are these large format retail stores. The actual main basin is located in the center, and there's housing that runs along the east edge, and these solar parasols kind of roll out of the facade, this kind of sunscreen over the building, and actually then move through the project. The film was used as a means of, I'm sorry that it's not working on this, but the film was actually used as a means of we worked together with Turner Films, and we used it as a means of trying to lock into the different narratives using film of the different kinds of reasons that agendas and itineraries that people would have who would have a reason for coming to visit here. So rather than this being a kind of thing about a kind of landscape urbanist discourse about a project which is entirely ecology driven, each of the bodies of water, though it looks very much the same, in fact has a completely different purpose. This one happens to be a trout pond. There's another one which is actually a public swimming pool. There's another one which is a water park. And then there's actually a kind of floodplain at the bottom which serves as a play field, and so on. And this so-called beach, which faces west and which can be used by the community, is pulled up, and differing public functions such as a police substation, a library, and public, the locker rooms for the swimming pool facility and so on, all are located along here. And this, in effect, serves as a kind of, again, open enclave for the community to actually for people to bring their kids so that they actually don't go. The problem right now is that kids have to be picked up and taken to school by their parents and sit home at the end of the day watching television because they're afraid of being shot. So through the synergy of actually having the sheriff's substation and an actual place that people can use as a kind of haven, the attempt was to create a kind of a critical mass of activity of both people who are able to watch and wanted to be there, like seniors, as well as kids who actually needed to be watched. But from a formal standpoint, we were using those various elements more in a kind of a scenographic role, kind of coming together. So tailoring the idea of these umbrellas as something that actually kind of operated according to the same scenario or theme as the water that kind of composed the beach and so on. This is from the freeway. Here you're looking down on the kind of board. This is kind of the boarding area that is over the roofs of the retail. The beaches are over more of the public areas that are to the back. The housing is along the very far back. All of the housing actually has its back decks looking out on the main area. These are actually all, this is housing for all people who would be working at the medical center when it reopens, and so on. So the idea is that rather than being through a kind of scattered site revitalization, we're trying to kind of create a big bang that is a kind of self-supporting entity. The last thing I wanted to show you was this little experiment that we did for Westwood Village, just concluded a couple of weeks ago. And I'm going to do a little bit of an experiment. I'm not going to really show you the project in the way that that you would typically have it explained to you. I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of agenda that I think we really had in the end, which was not so much about what the project was about, but a way of approaching this project and other projects. And I think that the interest so we used the project more as a kind of subtext for some other things that we've been thinking about that started with the movie that we made for the last project, about how to convey ideas about architecture, architectural projects in ways that seem to address the question of audience, in rather than somehow this artificial idea about what the true intention of the author was. And I've thought a lot over the last several years about the dedication of the kind of myth that I think architects carry themselves, that the necessary act of persuasion that we all are involved in requires verisimilitude, giving that the credibility of the project has somehow to do with the appearance of truth. And we all know, we've all seen two different models, predominant models by which this is conveyed. One is through what I call the farmed out rendering, which I could have shown you 4 more of these, and then 16 of them, and then 25, and then 64, and they would start looking more and more the same. But it's through the truthfulness of the rendering that somehow it seems to have a kind of inevitability that you have to build this because look at how real it is. But I'm not going to bore you with the facts. You just are going to have to take it on its intrinsic value. I'm going to try to sort of seduce you through the use of the sunset and dusk. And then, of course, there's the infamous datascape, which is that you throw pages and pages of data at people to the point that you are completely confounded by what it all means. And then a project somehow seems to miraculously emerge out of all of that data, whose connection to the original data you have a really hard time understanding. But somehow or other, you created a kind of ladies and gentlemen trusting I know what I'm doing kind of appearance that in a weird way, though it seems the opposite, is actually still equally dedicated to the idea of appearance of truth. So whether on reality TV or movie visual effects, the line between fact and fiction today has become increasingly blurred. And as a medium of communication, architecture has exploited this tendency as much as any media production. Largely, these are these two developments that I've talked about. What I became interested in was an article that I read by Malcolm Gladwell, in which he talked about the idea that there's been a fundamental change in the nature of the way that we understand the complexity of the world today. He said he distinguished between what he calls a puzzle and a mystery. I don't know how many of you have read this. And he contrasts Watergate and Enron. He says he calls Watergate a puzzle and Enron a mystery. He said a puzzle possesses a clear answer, but finding it is due to a lack of information. It grows easier to solve with the addition of each piece of information. Mysteries, on the other hand, don't have a simple factual answer. They require judgments and the assessment of uncertainty. And the hard part is not that we have too little information, but that we have too much. Puzzles come to satisfying conclusions. Mysteries often don't. Now that most of the world is open, not closed, mysteries increasingly take center stage. And he explains that, in fact, in the case of Enron, they were not guilty of concealing information. All of the information was there for the public to see. It was just that one journalist who was smart enough managed to take it apart and figure out that they had done something wrong. So, by Gladwell's definition, they're both, both of the models that I've shown you, the rendering and these various diagrams of information, both resort to the withholding of information so as not to, they're both puzzles. While the first one resorts to the withholding of information so as not to distract from the gloss of its initial impression. The other parades as a mystery, using a mirage of information, but as a means of creating a mask of rationale behind which the specific design proposition, let's use different examples. This is who I have in mind. Stands as a foregone conclusion, an object illustration of a linear, simplistic process by which it was generated, a puzzle that comes with instructions on how it is or was solved. So I became interested in the idea of the use in the newspaper, and the actual, this is a copy of The Onion. I don't know how many of you actually read this, of the fake newspaper. But the newspaper as a vehicle, which is both, in the case of The Onion, is incredibly funny, but at the same time, as a vehicle, is an incredibly effective means or could be a very effective means of maintaining the appearance of objectivity, but in fact being able to address the differing of viewpoints of the people who are actually receiving information. So what it seems especially apropos of is the fact that is Gladwell's point that the overabundance of information that he refers to has had a dramatic and largely unexamined effect upon how we, the public, receive content from the altered truth that we are complicit with for the sake of its vicarious entertainment value, such as reality TV and special effects in movies, to the hyper-partisanship with which the truth is so often equated to self-interest in politics. In other words, it's all how you want to spin it. We have moved from questioning the truthfulness of a single set of facts, such as Watergate, to using whatever collection of them is convenient as agitprops to substantiate predetermined arguments and agendas. As a result, the relation of power to information is no longer assumed, but rather emerges as a function of the way that the latter is shaped by and transmitted with respect to the audience. And so this gets back to gets back to the first point that I made at the beginning of the lecture, which is that as our culture at large becomes more fragmented in its interests and values, mere expression and transparency do not equate to persuasion any more than does the seamlessness of the farmed out rendering. Let's see, I'll talk about that in a second. Instead, our current climate would seem to demand the development of new formats of delivery, ones that are able to both address and to cross-cut existing social, political, and economic statics that condition virtually every project that is subject to public scrutiny. And so the newspaper, therefore, seemed like an incredibly good vehicle for doing this, because its appearance of truthfulness, it has a certain appearance of truthfulness, yet at the same time cops to the idea that either in terms of its content or in terms of area where it makes editorials, that it's taking a clear point of view and is making no apologies for the fact that it's simply showing you different vantage points of the same stuff that's going on a given event over the course of one day or 1 week. There has been some history of the use of the newspaper or the magazine in the case of Adolf Loos and Corbusier, who actually were very similarly unapologetic and understood the power of using it as a kind of form of propaganda that would enhance their argument for their project by giving you various vantage points of the kinds of things, differing ideas of the kinds of ways in which their project would relate to things that were out in the world. There were, for instance, both of them used advertisers who manufactured the kinds of projects, the kinds of equipment that would go in their work, so that you kind of, when you were reading the magazine, you had a kind of full, a rather robust sense of all of the various elements that contributed to the vision that they were trying to convey. They had other authors writing about them and so on. So in that sense, the newspaper becomes a very good means of trying to put my diagrams of analysis of existing case study properties in forward gear, and to try to promote a sense to everybody who's a stakeholder that there is an open forum where you acknowledge the existence of the others. As you search for the article that deals with what you're interested in, you have to invariably come across the points of view that are being addressed to others. In that sense, it has a little, it has the quality of time code where you're tracking the trajectories of the different characters through this, rather than through a single narrative, which would be the architect. This is another one of the diagrams from Under the Influence, where you're actually tracking what the relative degree of importance is to each of the different stakeholders. The newspaper would have a means of actually trying to engage this. It wouldn't be unlike a prism where a single beam is able to be split into this kind of, the project may still have a certain degree of singularity, but the newspaper as a means of conveying what it's about is able to simultaneously tell you many things about it. and thereby serve as a means of enabling somebody to understand its underlying intelligence. Also, blow-up comes to mind, where no matter how many times you look at the same picture over and over again, you keep noticing new things that are actually in it, or from differing points of view. So in this project, which was I don't want to be too dismissive about it, but it was a revitalization or visioning study that's done 100 times every year in Los Angeles, none of which ever come to fruition because it ends up on a notebook on a shelf and everybody argues, oh no, they're not listening to me, and so on. So that's why, to a certain extent, we decided that we're going to try this as an experiment to see whether or not the newspaper would make a difference. We, in effect, first started by identifying each of the ones we had in the project. I won't get into that. Each of the colors represents one of the different parties that's responsible for a different part of the project. That I'm pulling out now from that to begin to allow you to see what the larger newspaper is like. So each of these drawings that we created is in the newspaper. This is the two of the inner pages of the newspaper. You've got all the sections that it typically has: arts and entertainment, eat and drink, opinion. You've got arguments about whether something that we had put in there was a good idea or a bad idea. And it kind of it co-opts, in some senses it's intended to co-opt or preempt the discussion, the argumentation, by already putting it out there. And it's also intended to be a means. It's written 20 years into the future, so it's intended to actually try to argue for the intelligence of aspects of the scheme that are not immediately evident at the future time by writing a story about the role that it will play at that given point in time. That actually was the logic for why it happened. There's a lot of, this is the editorial area. It even has a crossword puzzle. And then as we zoom in on this, which is kind of the money shot, which is these towers that were so controversial in the project, which have images of the old towers that had once stood in Westwood. There was a story. It was necessary to put in the newspaper a kind of explanation as to the fact, to show the history as well as the future vision, that explains that in fact this is not something that's coming out of, it's not a height issue about that this village has never had before, but actually that these towers have been there all along, and that in fact it's actually putting back something that was righting a wrong, and so on and so forth. So the paper enables us to kind of make an argument in answer to each of the specific complaints or concerns that differing ones of the groups had. I won't get into a lot of detail. We actually used one of the towers that still remains as a kind of primitive to pull off differing of the differing tactics and strategies that we then deploy within the village itself. So there's a kind of false historicism, a kind of, that we would use to kind of spirit in differing development strategies, such as these larger woodwork towers. We also argued for other alternatives, showed why other alternatives did not work by showing what would happen if you just didn't do the towers and how you would cover the entire village with the same square footage, wiping out all 44 of the landmarks that were in the village, which if you didn't do it, people would simply argue that you were killing it, and because they wouldn't understand alternative paths. And then here, this was the more surgical approach. And then we also there were very funny stories as well about that actually had serious underpinnings having to do with how the alleys were being improved, and or how the towers were going to be a little lower than the original towers, that were that were able to embed serious and contentious issues with funny stories about things that people that those in the neighborhood knew of or could imagine having being there. And then all of the entrepreneurs, the people who would be attracted to the village, actually all had, there were fictitious ads that were put in there for bike valets that all basically supported the different narratives that were talked about in different articles, but actually occurred in different places within the paper itself. So the idea was to, in a way, diffuse the argument that the form itself was expected somehow to be the primary means upon which the argument would rest, but rather to actually harness the partisanship by actually addressing each of them full on and being able to tell the story in a variety of different ways that in fact didn't necessitate that people have to read. If they weren't interested in knowing about the whole project, they only wanted to read about one thing, that it was actually told through that specific lens, and that alone would go much further toward actually discussing, toward actually arguing for the project rather than some kind of univalent approach. I know I'm going late, so I'm just flipping through these very quickly. There are just a few more. This was part of the project had to do with moving all the cultural resources at UCLA out of the campus where people couldn't find them and get to them and couldn't have dinner there, down into the village itself. And then we actually started in the classifieds to include a lot of the events at which the project is actually being presented now, so that in effect the message was that the future begins now. We were presenting it at the Hammer, and this slide that I'm showing was shown at the Hammer, so that actual, past and future, the future is becoming the past, and the idea was that the newspaper was becoming a kind of a document that could be written over and revised as kind of changes were, as history started to unfold, and the kind of so-called vision began to develop, presumably through the next issue. Thank you. Yeah, of course.
One question, because this seems to the end to be about designing format, and so.
The last thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it sort of is I guess, a logical extension of some of the work, but it seems like now it's really about constructing an audience for it and how you convey that. Like, the stories used to be all the work concept went into the project, and now it seems like trying to unfold it to the reception of the project.
Well, it wasn't intended, we didn't, I may have kind of overplayed the point at which we actually realized that the newspaper was actually the right vehicle to do this. We walked in somewhat naive into the project at the beginning, where we were somewhat ambushed by all the contentiousness that surrounded it. And we realized what an impossible situation we were in after we were in it a week or two. And so we realized, to a certain extent, so I'm not necessarily making apologies for it, but to a certain extent we realized that the solution was fruitless. There was no way that we were going to solve the problem in just the 2 weeks, less than 2 weeks they had given us. But we got the idea that the newspaper, it was kind of the beginning of an experiment whose ultimate value will not able to be proven or really fully explored until the next project, where the feedback that comes from actually thinking through these differing strands can be fed into a way of actually thinking about how you actually work on the project in such a way that you can actually unfold something that in fact, let's say within the discourse possesses a certain singularity, but unfolds as a series of things that appear to be much more heterogeneous. So you're absolutely right. You're right about that. That's why I kind of prefaced at the beginning the idea that there are a number of these things were kind of open-ended experiments, and this is clearly the most open-ended one of them. But I do believe, having come up with the format, that there's some way. I mean, I think I was working with Edwin Chan from Gary's office, who was collaborating with me. I think we became convinced that having invented the format, that there was a way of being able to backfeed that in to a way of thinking about how exactly one could actually look at what the implications that work. Yeah.
I find that the medium actually really provocative, but to make it into the future undermines the nature of what newspaper is, which is it's about the present. And if you already have a landscape, a social landscape, or in that project, which you call contentious, then in some ways you could just make those arguments by being completely in the present. Because then that becomes more like a top-down architect saying, look, I'm going to make sure. He's just being really clever about being top-down.
I'm not sure. I actually felt that there's a kind of a part of the problem of the contentiousness is that there is a kind of phenomenon of immediate gratification, like what can you do for me today? And it seemed necessary to us. There were two things that I think that are important here. One is that is there a way of talking about the future without the project being futuristic? I mean, there are plenty of people who design things that look like the future in the present, but all they in the end up doing is becoming a historic artifact of what that period of time thought the future was going to be. And next project, looking what the opportunities are here, I wonder about whether or not my interest is in looking at how one can embed a sense of what the future value of something is that will be divulged in time, but the newspaper has to serve as a vehicle, or the newspaper could serve as a vehicle for trying to explain. In other words, the project doesn't need to look futuristic to be about the future. And my sense, it's hard for me to articulate, but it seems as though there's a way to have something that may look strange or odd or out of place, but not because it's futuristic. But simply, you just don't know you don't understand it. And that the newspaper could serve as an aid, I guess I use the term agitprop, as a means of trying to explain that through, a story that takes place at a given point in time where somebody goes, oh, I get it, somehow. It's kind of a resistance, it was the NPJ or whatever that was, the farmed out rendering thing, that's trying to address somehow. But the problem is that when people are, the contentiousness is that people are only thinking about what's immediately in front of them, and that's why those books always end up on the shelf. Because it's like, oh, that's 4 years, that'll never happen. So the newspaper is intended to, in some senses, try to move from the present kind of into the future by being able to kind of tell, to talk about how that thing will unfold without doing a phasing, just using a phasing diagram, which is a bit cold.
Yeah, then I wonder about rethinking what a newspaper of the future would look like.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, we were very well aware of the fact that they may not be there. We were putting some of the codes on as a kind of thing at the end to try to sort of say, look, this could be on the website, or it's transmitted in that way. You're right. I think that would be something that I'd like to explore. Ideally, we would have set up a website, had it there, and then would have edited the content as it was happening.
I think that's what's interesting, that the format is very typical
Deadpan.
vernacular, and then you're actually feeding atypical content into this typical format. I mean, it's like Jimenez's comics to me, as our faculty, who says uses multiple forms of architectural representation, but what hangs them together is a comic as a format or a genre. So you can deploy lots of different strategies of architectural representation that all get made cohesive by virtue of the found organization of the newspaper, which is an interesting strategy to be objective and everyday simultaneously.
Well, the other thing we did, which I think was, it was kind of fun to do too, but we were talking about science fiction earlier today. We were using things and people that they already knew. I mean, we were talking about real things that we were mixing together with the stuff that was being proposed, so that it became more difficult for them to say, oh, that's not going to work, because the village is like this, it should remain like this. But if you start to, in the same story, in an article, have pictures of, oh, like, yeah, I know that, and that thing happened 3 years ago, and so on, suddenly it starts to become fitted into a trajectory where it becomes easier to somehow, I don't want to make it sound like it's about getting them to swallow something, that they begin to imagine that they can see the trajectory by connecting the dots between things. But I think the documentary information, the nonfiction information is important to put in there because it helps to build some degree of a certain degree of appearance of truth, at least from that particular perspective.
But I think you're more Watergate than Enron.
You do?
Yeah. I think the problem with the other two representations, the rendering and the datascape, are actually too much information in both of them.
Really? Yeah.
So therefore, undecided because there's too much verisimilitude and specificity at a high resolution, or too much facts that the datascape collected. I mean, this operates more like a puzzle because you have to reconstruct the pieces. So I don't know. It seems that this is more open to an audience, whereas the others seem closed by virtue of their high definition and over saturation.
I mean, too much is accounting. Too much is too much information. Yeah.
If the proposition is for a progressive model of urban design, you've got kind of a hybrid going on. And my question is there are two ways to understand it. One is that there are other hybrid models, and you're just further to the left of them, possibly coming out of the architectural tradition. And the other one is that you're actually a later take on urban design. And I'm curious, who's on the bookshelf next to you? So who would the student go look at to try to understand the context of your work more fully?
That's pretty hard. I mean, I would say that it's right now. My feeling is that I think that the field of urban design has vanished, and planning has vanished into policy. And I don't feel that. I don't mean to offend anybody here, but I think that the annexation of the design of urbanism by landscape architects is not the answer, because it isn't actually urbanism. It's just more landscape taking over the city. I guess if you were to ask me what's next to me, I'm saying I'm not looking at other architects now. I think you need to be actually looking at, maybe it's a McLuhan-like thing, where the space is the message. In other words, it's looking at techniques that advertisers are using. It's looking at product design, because cities can now image themselves through a product that happens to be prevalent in one place. So I think it's both disciplinary and it's scalar. So it's kind of I feel that it's a kind of more radical shift from questions of what the urban design, who the urban design models are. I think that it's gone, and it may be at one point in time, it may be something. It may be urban design again, meaning you're working in making urban spaces, and what I'm interested in is urban experience. And urban experience is not, even if it's made by architects, it's not made by architecture as a discipline. It's being comprised by a conflation, like a cocktail of different disciplines. Expertise is put together in very particular ways. And I think that's what's interesting to me right now, because I think that's what the public considers to be experience. I think urban design does take place today. It takes place in places like City Walk, these RSAUD Disney communities, and it succeeds, but it doesn't succeed in a way that I believe is a viable model for everybody from where most of the culture is at. Yeah.
Simple question, what came out of the Target project? How did Target?
They were really interested in it, but they asked me to show it to the architects, and it was just. Well, they were. The architects say the funny part is they said, yeah, nice try. They actually said, we already do that. They actually said, we actually already do that. We're working in these we're working in urban areas. I mean, I don't think that they. The thing was that it was validation that the problem was actually the case, because they actually confirmed that all of the assumptions we made were correct. That people are coming there for different reasons, that they have a hard time getting into urban communities, that they have to do more, and so on and so forth, but they looked at it as more of a programming problem. Yeah,
Do those projects, the target projects, have a third scale? You know, they have the scale of the graphic where it's sort of a program embedded icon, and then you close up, you're using the space. But zoomed out, is it part of a greater context or community?
yeah, they all do. I mean, I don't know if this is answering your question, but they were all specifically situated in differing contexts. We weren't able to, I mean, it was just a massive amount of work, so we weren't able to show street views in addition to the views that were actually within the project itself, which is, you know, would have been nice to do. I mean, there were some cases in which there were kind of mid-rise buildings nearby, so you would have actually gotten more of a kind of a bird's eye view as well. But there was still a kind of clear operating system, which had to do with the slope that was in all cases, and it was really just the kind of working of the slope. And the presumption was that, you know, that there was, in all three cases, the bottom of it, the foot of the slope engages the street by, you know, something that carves into it, like the street system that comes into it and sort of serves as a means of getting into the project down at the foot, as well as just driving in off the side and driving up to the roof and then coming in through the top. There were two different ways that you could get out to it. No? Okay. Well, thank you.